clan inheritance settles better than any will ever could the exact question of how little the winning side thought of the losing one, and the House of Spencer settled it in a bedroom at Althorp on March 31st, 1992. 2 days earlier, the 8th Earl Spencer had died of a heart attack, and his will had asked his children to grant his widow 6 months to gather her life and go. She was given 48 hours instead. A maid named Pauline Shaw knelt folding a countess's wardrobe into 4 open Louis Vuitton suitcases, while Diana, Princess of Wales, stood guard at the door. And when Diana noticed the embossed letter S on the suitcase locks, she decided the luggage itself was Spencer property and could not leave the house. So the clothes came out again, the furs and the couture and the evening gowns, and they went into black plastic bin liners instead. Then the new 9th Earl, Diana's younger brother Charles, gathered up the sacks and kicked them down the grand saloon staircase, the same staircase where, 3 years before, Diana had shoved the same woman and watched her fall. The woman at the bottom of those stairs was not destitute and was not defeated. She had a Mayfair townhouse waiting and a reported £4 million in her late husband's will, and she would go on to marry a French count, sit on the board of Harrods, and outlive her stepdaughter by 19 years. She had, by most sober accounts, saved the very house she was now being thrown out of. She had nursed the Earl through a coma the doctors did not expect him to survive. She had opened the estate to the public, run the accounts, funded the roof, and taken the blame for every canvas that left the walls to pay for it. And for all of it, at the end, she got the bin bags. Her name was Raine, Countess Spencer, born Raine McCorquodale in 1929, the only daughter of the romance novelist Barbara Cartland, and for a stretch of roughly 17 years she was the most hated stepmother in England. The children called her Acid Raine. They sang a nursery rhyme at her that they never finished. Then, in one of the strangest reversals in the modern Spencer story, the child who hated her most became the one who called her the mother she never had. In today's episode of Old Money Allure, we trace how a debutante manufactured by her own mother became the villain of the House of Spencer, how she won every practical battle at Althorp and lost the war of memory anyway, and how the estrangement that defined her reversed into something like love just before both women ran out of time. Raine McCorquodale was born on September 9th, 1929, at 6 Culross Street in Mayfair, the only child of Captain Alexander McCorquodale, heir to a printing fortune, and Barbara Cartland, who had married him in 1927 after, by her own telling, declining 49 previous proposals. The marriage did not last. Alexander and Barbara divorced when Raine was a small child, amid mutual charges of infidelity that spilled into the newspapers, and by the age of 7, Raine was already the subject of a scandal she had not caused. Cartland then married Alexander's own first cousin, Hugh McCorquodale, and turned her formidable attention to the daughter she had once wished had been a son. She told the BBC as much in 1991, saying she had been disappointed to have had a daughter and would rather have had a dozen boys, adding that she did not much like women and thought men were marvellous because they were the heroes of her books. The daughter she got instead she decided to build. To understand Raine, you have to understand what her mother did for a living, which was to invent flawless women who married well and were rewarded for it. Cartland would eventually publish 723 novels, dictating them to secretaries at a rate that once reached 23 books in a single year, and she moved through the world in flamingo pink silk, false eyelashes coated in shoe polish so the mascara would not run, and a white Rolls-Royce with a pink mohair rug. She treated Raine's upbringing as another manuscript to be revised until it was perfect. Cartland later admitted the method to a biographer, saying she had decided her daughter had perfect features and a lovely figure, and so resolved to produce her as a beauty, that she used to bully her and become furious with her, and that the bullying worked. When a young Raine came home having topped her class, her mother's response was not congratulation, but the observation that there was a gravy stain on her shirt. The stories behind figures like Raine Spencer, the ancestral collections she liquidated, and the family war that consumed her stepdaughter's short life receive extended treatment in our free Substack newsletter, where the personal and financial wreckage, too complex for documentary format, reveals what these extraordinary lives actually cost the people who lived them. The Spencer saga belongs in that company. It is a story about a woman who was assembled the way a novel is assembled, from the outside in, and who spent the rest of her life being accused of assembling everything else the same way. What Cartland built was not a scholar or a wit, but a presentation, a girl trained in elocution and etiquette, and dressed in frothy dresses designed to project an eternal smile. The tragedy that would follow her was that she learned the lesson too well. In 1947, at 18, Raine was presented at the court of King George VI and named Debutante of the Year, the single most public confirmation that Cartland's project had succeeded. The dance lessons and the wardrobe and the years of correction had produced exactly what they were meant to produce, a young woman the London season could not stop looking at. Cartland treated the debut the way a producer treats an opening night, and the reviews were everything she had wanted. A later account noted that Raine had been greeted by Princess Elizabeth as a baby, and that the standards around her had been set high from the cradle. She was not merely out in society, she was, for one season, its defining ornament, and she would carry the polish of that year for the rest of her life. The following year, on July 21st, 1948, she married Gerald Legge, a city accountant who was heir to the earldom of Dartmouth, at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. There were 16 bridesmaids in crinolines and a reception at Londonderry House, and the guest list carried the Mountbattens. Legge would become Viscount Lewisham in 1958, and the 9th Earl of Dartmouth in 1962, and Raine, who collected titles across her life the way other women collected jewellery, would later joke that Lewisham was her favourite of all of them, because it was on the buses. The marriage produced 4 children over 20 years. William in 1949, Rupert in 1953, Charlotte in 1963, and Henry in 1968. It also produced in public the image of a devoted wife who called her husband the Rock of Gibraltar, divine, so steady and strong, and yet with such humour. The Cartland grooming apparatus did not stop at the debut, and it is worth pausing on how total it was, because Raine would spend the rest of her life being accused of manufacturing herself, when in fact she had been manufactured by an expert. Cartland dressed her in flamboyant colour, drilled her in the art of the entrance, and taught her that a woman's presentation was not vanity, but strategy, the whole of a woman's leverage in a world run by men. When Raine deployed those lessons later, in council chambers and at Althorp, the family and the press would read them as evidence of a grasping nature, as if the confidence had been a scheme rather than a training. It was Cartland who had installed the machinery, and Cartland who had made clear that a gravy stain mattered more than a top mark in class. The daughter simply ran the machine, as she had been taught all her life, and was punished for how well it ran. What the Polish concealed was a woman with ambitions that a decorative marriage could not contain. Cartland had trained her to be looked at, but Raine wanted to be listened to, and the tension between those two impulses would define everything that came next. She had been made into a beauty by a mother who did not like women, and she had married into a title she wore with real relish, and yet the eternal smile she had been taught to project was a mask over something restless and unusually capable. Her mother, meanwhile, remained a force in her own right, a Hertfordshire county councillor, and a public personality who held the longest entry in Who's Who, longer than Winston Churchill's, so that Raine grew up in the shadow of a woman who was famous, formidable, and impossible to fully please. The debutante of 1947 was about to do something debutantes were not built to do. She was going to run for office. In 1954, at the age of 23, Raine became the youngest member elected to Westminster City Council, standing as a Conservative and refusing to pretend she was anything other than what she was. She campaigned in her furs and her jewellery, and when asked about it she said she always deliberately dressed up and wore all of it, because everyone knew she had them anyway. It was the Cartland lesson turned to a new purpose. The presentation deployed not to catch a husband but to win a seat, and it worked. She would spend roughly the next 17 years in local government, sitting on Westminster's planning and parks and personnel committees, then representing Lewisham South on the London County Council, then Richmond upon Thames on the new Greater London Council. She was very good at it, and she knew it. Her most durable public achievement came at the head of the Covent Garden Development Committee, which she chaired in the early 1970s. London was in the grip of a demolition mood, and there were serious plans to tear through Covent Garden and remake it as a modern district of offices and roads. Raine fought that, and the fight was later described by the Telegraph as a well-merited and important role in preventing the destructive redevelopment of one of the city's oldest quarters. She worked on historic preservation, championed the saving of buildings including the grand facade of the Tate Gallery, chaired a government working party for the United Nations Environment Conference in Stockholm, and threw herself into the British Tourist Authority. Prince Philip is supposed to have summed her up in a single line, saying that if you wanted to get anything organised, you sent for Raine. The people who worked with her described a person who never took prisoners and never accepted no for an answer, and one friend later joked, only half unkindly, that she would have made an excellent chairperson of the rail network, and like Mussolini, would have made the trains run on time. This was not the flighty ornament the tabloids would later paint. This was a working politician who had put in 17 years of committee rooms and planning disputes and unglamorous municipal grind, the kind of service that builds a city quietly and wins no headlines, and she did it while raising 4 children and running a household. The Covent Garden fight alone would have justified a career. The district that draws millions of visitors today exists in the form it does partly because a Conservative councillor in furs refused to let the planners flatten it. She never won a seat in the House of Commons, partly because her first husband would not let her attend political events in the evenings or at weekends, a restriction that tells you a great deal about the marriage. Here was a woman with genuine administrative gifts, real civic accomplishment, and a talent for getting difficult things done, boxed inside a life that valued her mainly for how she looked walking into a room. She had built a public self that was more than the debutante her mother had produced. What she had not yet found was a stage large enough to spend it on, or a man willing to hand her the keys. In 1973, on an architectural heritage committee, Raine met John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, the man who would become the 8th Earl Spencer, and who was then described as the unhappiest man in London. His unhappiness had a history. He had married Frances Roche, and the marriage had ended in one of the ugliest aristocratic divorces of the era. Frances had fallen in love in 1966 with Peter Shand Kidd, heir to a wallpaper fortune, and told Johnny about the affair in the autumn of 1967. What followed was a slow public catastrophe. Frances had already taken Diana and Charles to London that October, leaving the 2 elder daughters, Sarah and Jane, at boarding school. When the family reunited that Christmas at Park House on the Sandringham estate, Johnny refused to let the children go back to London with their mother, and Frances left alone. She sued for custody in 1968 and lost, in part because her own mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, testified against her, and the divorce was made absolute in 1969. The children who lived through that divorce were the same children Raine would later inherit, and their formation matters to everything that came after. Diana, the youngest daughter, later told Andrew Morton that her mother's departure was the biggest disruption of her childhood, and a genuinely painful experience, and she carried a memory of watching her father slap her mother across the face while she hid behind a door. These were not children who would welcome a glamorous replacement, and they were certainly not children who would forgive one for arriving in furs. Frances, meanwhile, had retreated to a farmhouse on a Scottish island near Oban, and lived a comparatively withdrawn life, which only sharpened the contrast when Raine appeared, immaculate and formidable, and painted in colours. utterly unlike the quiet, distant mother they had lost. Raine's own family understood what was happening before the public did. Her brother Ian McCorquodale later said he did not think Raine had ever intended to fall in love with Johnny Spencer, that it had simply happened, that it was real love and that the two of them adored each other, and that their mother had been rather bemused by the whole thing. Cartland was said to have voiced some consternation, and the press would eventually settle on the reading it preferred, which was that Raine was an ambitious social climber with designs on Althorp. The truth was messier and less convenient for a headline. A capable, restless woman in a hollow marriage had met a wounded, wealthy widower in a house that needed exactly the kind of energy she had spent 2 decades unable to fully spend. Johnny succeeded to the earldom on June 9th, 1975, on the death of his father, and with the title came Althorp itself, a 500-year-old house in Northamptonshire that was less a prize than a standing debt, magnificent and cold and ruinously expensive to keep. He inherited a name, a seat and a bill, and within a year both of their old marriages were finished. On July 14th, 1976, Bastille Day, Raine married Johnny Spencer in a civil ceremony at Caxton Hall Register Office in London, only weeks after her own divorce from Gerald Legger had become final. The wedding was conducted with a secrecy so complete that it functioned as a declaration of war on the family she was joining. Johnny's own children were not told in advance and were left off the guest list entirely. His eldest daughter, Sarah, told reporters they had not been asked to attend, and the 4 Spencer children learned that their father had remarried by reading it in the newspapers the following day. It was the worst possible introduction to a stepmother, and it set the emotional terms for the next 16 years. Diana was 15 when it happened, and her reaction by her own later account was physical. She said that as she remembered it, she had slapped her father across the face and told him it was from all of them for hurting them, and then walked out and slammed the door. It is a small scene, one teenager and her father in a room, but it contains the whole coming conflict in miniature, the child appointing herself the voice of the family's grievance, and the parent choosing the new wife anyway. Charles was 12. The 2 older sisters were grown, but all 4 shared the same instant verdict, and it did not soften. A royal biographer would later put it plainly, writing that they hated Raine from day one, and that none of them ever made any effort to conceal their dislike of the formidable woman who had, as they saw it, stolen their father's affections and much of his expenditure budget. There was, from the start, another woman standing in the space Raine was accused of stealing, and that woman was Frances, the mother the children had lost. Raine could never win against a memory, because the children were not comparing her to a real present rival, but to an idealized absence, the mother who had been driven from the house when they were small, and whose departure Diana called the biggest disruption of her childhood. Every bright new sofa Raine installed was, to them, a paving over of the place their mother had known. Every attention their father paid his glamorous new wife was, to them, an attention stolen from a family that had already been broken once. Raine walked into a grief she had not caused, and was made to carry it as though she had, and no amount of competence or care would ever let her set it down. Raine's own words to her mother about the marriage give the other side of it, the side the press had no use for. She told Cartland that it was just like one of her books, that she was wildly in love, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. She had married for love into a 500-year-old house, at a stage of life when she might have expected the drama to be behind her. What she walked into instead was a family that had already decided who she was, a set of children rehearsing a grievance she could not answer, and a title, Countess Spencer, that came attached to a hostility no amount of competence would ever fully cure. She would spend the next 16 years proving that competence anyway, and it would not save her. Raine arrived at Althorp, the Spencer seat in Northamptonshire that had belonged to the family since 1508, and reportedly took one look at its genteel gloom and nicknamed it Gloomsville. The house was magnificent and cold and expensive, the kind of inheritance that quietly ruins the families it is supposed to glorify. And she set about the only project she knew how to run, which was a total transformation. She covered shabby furniture in bright new fabric, replaced the old Victorian lampshades with pink ones, put in vibrant sofas, and spent, by one estimate, around £2 million over the following years, remaking the interiors. Her own defence was uncomplicated. She said she believed she had done a wonderful job, that there were bright sofas to sit on, and you could still look at the Rubens on the walls and feel lucky to be living there. The family saw an act of vandalism. Diana's elder sister Sarah delivered the line that would define the redecoration forever, saying she would sooner take up residence in Lenin's tomb, cuddling the corpse for warmth, than have Raine for a stepmother. Charles Spencer, decades later, wrote the most quoted verdict of all, describing the South drawing room, for generations a model of handsome English reserve, becoming a cacophony of clashing pinks, pink silk walls, pink silk curtains, pink French rug, pink sofas, plump pink cushions, as if the room had been a blush at the sickliness of it all. He said his stepmother's taste had the wedding cake vulgarity of a five-star hotel in Monaco. The Independent reported that her powder-puff choices had turned one of England's finest stately homes into a tart's boudoir. In one detail, almost too neat to be true, she was said to have taken down the portrait of Robert, the first Baron Spencer, that hung over the main staircase, and replaced it with a life-size oil painting of herself in her prime. There is a reading of the redecoration that the family never allowed, which is that it was necessary. Aristocratic houses of this scale do not run on air, and Raine understood that keeping the show on the road meant earning something close to £500,000 a year. She cut domestic staff, opened the ancestral seat to paying visitors, and filled the calendar with car launches, open days, dinner dances and concerts to make the estate pay for itself. Johnny fully endorsed all of it, and Raine was always clear about whose house it was, saying she got flack, but that it was what John wanted to do. The Independent, in a rare moment of fairness toward her, noted that in truth she did little more than many aristocrats had done, when faced with a vast, stately home and an income that was not remotely stately, that the arithmetic of these places is brutal, and someone always has to solve it. Raine solved it, and the family hated the solution because it changed the house they remembered from childhood into something that took coach parties and sold tickets and looked, to their eyes, like a hotel. The pink sofas were mockable, and she was mocked without mercy. But the pink sofas were also, in part, a business plan for an inheritance that would otherwise have slowly consumed itself, run by the one person in the family with the administrative nerve to run it, and the coach parties she invited in were the same coach parties that would one day pay to see Diana's grave on the island in the lake. The redecoration was expensive, and part of how it was paid for became the single most damaging fact of Raine's life. Between 1976 and 1992, works of art and objects began to leave Althorp quietly, through a network of Bond Street dealers rather than the open auction rooms, and by Charles Spencer's own later estimate, roughly a fifth of the contents of the house was sold in those years, more than 200 items in all for a total he put at more than £15 million. The list, reconstructed across years of reporting, is genuinely painful. 11 paintings by Van Dyck, one of which went to the Getty Museum in California. 4 Van Dyck portraits of the Apostles, which Charles called the saddest loss. A Stubbs, the Duchess of Marlborough's dogs, which he called glorious. A Gotino that went to Kansas City, a Salvator Rosa that went eventually to the National Gallery, works by Reynolds and Rennie and others, and 2 gold ice pails made for the first Duke of Marlborough that went to the British Museum. Charles's real complaint was never only that the sales happened, but how. In his account, the objects were treated as chattels to be disposed of discreetly to avoid press interest, with the consequence that the full open market price could not be obtained. He told of works being sent to London dealers in laundry baskets from the back door to guarantee the anonymity of the sale, and he came to believe that in their determination to avoid publicity, his father and stepmother had simply been taken to the cleaners by the trade. The Salvator Rosa became his Exhibit A. It was sold in 1982 to a Bond Street gallery for $87,500, and 2 years later that gallery sold it on to the National Gallery for $612,500, 7 times what the family had received. To Charles, that was the whole scandal in one canvas, the family heritage flowing out at a discount to fund a redecoration he despised. There is a further complication the family rarely admitted, which is that the appetite for selling may have belonged as much to Johnny as to Raine. Charles himself, in his most candid moments, suggested that his father sold the collection partly in a kind of revenge, deriving a bleak pleasure from imagining the 7th Earl spinning in his grave, a man who had not felt loved as a child, settling scores with his own inheritance. If that is true, then Raine was the executor of a grievance that predated her arrival by a generation, the visible hand on sales that answered to a wound she had not caused. The family found it easier to blame the outsider than to sit with the possibility that their own father had wanted the walls emptied, and so the laundry baskets became her legend and not his. Raine's defense, given to the Los Angeles Times in 1991, was that she made none of these decisions. She said she got her orders from Johnny, that he told her what to do, and she did it, and that the possessions were his to do with as he liked. That was very likely true, and it did her no good at all, because the family needed a villain with a face, and Johnny was their father. So the paintings that left in laundry baskets became her crime specifically, and the cottages sold off the estate, forcing out tenant farmers, became her crime too. Whatever the accounting really was, the perception hardened into permanence. She had come to save the house, and in the family's telling she had looted it, and no ledger she could produce would ever change the story they had already agreed to tell. In 1978, only 2 years into the marriage, Johnny Spencer collapsed at Althorp with a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He fell into a coma, and the doctors gave him, by some accounts, as little as a 10% chance of survival. What Raine did next is the part of her life that even her enemies could not take from her. She set up a vigil at his bedside and stayed there day and night, and she was, by every account, ferociously territorial about his care. The biographer Penny Junor described her as fighting for his life and deciding that he did not need his children around him, that it would be better if he had peace and rest and no agitation. That decision, whatever its medical merit, became one more count in the family's indictment, because it meant the Spencer children were kept from their father's bedside during the weeks they feared he would die. Raine went further than any doctor advised. She reportedly sourced an experimental drug from Germany that had not been licensed in the United Kingdom and pushed the hospital to administer it, an act of will against medical convention that the family and the record have never quite known how to categorize. It was, in its way, the most Raine thing she ever did. A refusal to accept the professional verdict, a willingness to go outside the rules and around the objections to get the result she wanted, the same nerve that had built a career and remade a house now turned toward keeping a man breathing. Against the odds, Johnny recovered. He was never the same afterwards. His speech was affected and his movement was limited, and he would need to be supported when he walked Diana down the aisle 3 years later. But he was alive, and he stayed alive for another 14 years, and even the most hostile members of his family had to concede that Raine's care was the reason. One relative acknowledged that her attentive devotion had played a crucial role in his recovery over the 14 years that followed, a rare admission from a family that preferred to give her nothing. For a brief window, their gratitude was real. She had, one account noted, come closer to winning them over in that hospital than at any other time. And for a moment the petty songs stopped. The gratitude did not last, and its collapse is the hinge of the whole tragedy. Raine had done the hardest, least glamorous thing a person can do, sitting up through the nights with a dying man and refusing to let him die, and it bought her only a temporary truce. The blocking of the children from the bedside was remembered longer than the recovery it may have protected. Diana would later say that Raine basically blocked them out of the hospital and would not let them see their father, and the sentence was spoken as an accusation, not a fact to be weighed against the outcome. This was the pattern of Raine's entire life at Althorp, compressed into a single episode. She did the competent thing, the effective thing, the thing that worked, and she was resented for the manner of it more than she was ever thanked for the result. Devotion, in her case, kept being read as control. Chapter 8. The Wedding and the Snubs. On July 29, 1981, Johnny Spencer, still unsteady from the stroke his wife had nursed him through, walked his daughter Diana down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral to marry the Prince of Wales, and the seating that day told the family's story without a word being spoken. Raine attended, but she was not seated with her husband. While the Earl, Francis Shand Kidd, and the Spencer children sat opposite the royal family, Raine was placed in the congregation, and afterwards she did not appear on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the rest of the family. The most photographed moment in the history of the House of Spencer took place with the Countess of Spencer deliberately absent from the frame. It was a snub arranged in front of the entire world, and everyone who understood the family understood exactly what it meant. Raine was not the only member of her side kept at a distance. Her mother, Barbara Cartland, who had become Diana's step-grandmother through the marriage, and whose romance novels the young Diana had genuinely loved as a girl, was invited to the wedding, but allocated a poor seat behind a pillar. By her own later account, given to Prospect magazine, she chose to stay home and watch it on television, rather than attend from behind a column, a decision she framed publicly as generosity, saying the wedding was an occasion for younger people, and that she had asked for her place to be given to her son. During the engagement, she had been quietly thrilled and quietly wary at once, telling reporters that the whole thing mirrored her own plot lines, a chaste heroine falling for a rakish nobleman, while also warning that they would all die of fury if she said anything, since she was the only one with anything to sell and did not want to be accused of clinging to the royal bandwagon. Whatever the mixture of choice and exclusion, she was reported to have been humiliated by it, and the popular story that she was simply disinvited misses the sharper, sadder truth. She was invited in a way designed to make attending impossible to bear. The distance was mutual, and it was mannered, which was the Spencer way. Diana had not invited Cartland to a place of honour, and Cartland, for her part, kept a cutting little verdict in reserve, saying later that the only books Diana ever read were her own, and that they had not been awfully good for her. Once she learned how much Diana had loved those novels as a girl, Cartland had taken to sending her early copies, a small warmth between step-grandmother and step-granddaughter, that the wedding seating quietly cancelled. Between the two households ran a current of resentment that expressed itself not in shouting, but in seating charts and withheld invitations, in who stood on the balcony and who watched from a sofa. Raine had married into the family 5 years earlier, and remained, on the most public day of its life, an outsider positioned at the edge of the picture. The nickname the children had coined, Acid Raine, had by now settled into the language as if it had always been there, and the taunting half-rhyme they aimed at her, Raine, Raine, go away, deliberately never finished with the line about coming back another day. In September 1989, the family gathered at Althorp for the wedding of Diana's younger brother, Charles, to Victoria Lockwood, and it was there, at the top of the saloon stairs, that the long Cold War between Diana and her stepmother turned physical. Francis Shand Kidd had come down from Scotland, and Diana became convinced that Raine was not showing her own mother enough attention or respect in what had once been Francis's home. Raine's personal assistant, Sue Howe, later described what happened without softening it. Diana had a furious row with Raine because she was so upset that her mother had been ignored in the ancestral home, and she pushed her, and Raine fell down the stairs. She was badly bruised and dreadfully upset, and Howe called it a cruel, heartless thing to do that was not justified at all. Diana never expressed regret. In a recorded conversation with her voice coach in 1992, later made public. She said she had pushed Raine down the stairs and that it had given her enormous satisfaction, that she had wanted to throttle the stepmother who had brought her such grief. In the Morton tapes, she narrated the argument itself, saying she had told Raine she hated her so much, that if only she knew how much they all hated her for what she had done, that she had ruined the house and spent their father's money, and that when Raine answered that Diana had no idea how much pain her mother had put her father through, Diana had gone, in her own phrase, for her gullet. It is the most naked evidence in the whole record of what the estrangement actually felt like from the inside, and it is worth being honest about it. This was not a woman refusing to speak to another. This was a woman speaking to her at length in fury and then shoving her down a flight of stairs. Sue Howe offered one detail that complicates the simple picture of Diana defending her wounded mother, noting that part of what was happening was that Diana, at her own brother's wedding, was not the centre of attention for once, and did not handle it well. The observation does not excuse the push, but it points at something true about both women. They were each, in their way, formidable, and used to being looked at, and they were fighting over a house and a father and a mother's memory in a family that had never learned to grieve out loud. It is one of the harder passages in the whole story to sit with, because the woman who fell was not a monster, and the woman who pushed was, at that point in her life, near the height of her fame and the depth of her private misery, and neither of them was capable of the ordinary conversation that might have ended the war. What the staircase produced instead was a wound and a story, and the story would outlast the wound by decades. The staircase would become the stage for the tale's next act too. 3 years later, after Johnny was gone, the same steps would carry the bin bags, and the woman who had been pushed down them once would be swept out for good. Chapter 9. 2 days in March. Johnny Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer, died on March 29, 1992, of a heart attack at the Wellington Hospital in London, aged 68. He died suddenly with no one at his bedside, and Charles Spencer, now the 9th Earl, told reporters outside the hospital that it was a matter of regret that nobody had been with him at the end, because they had all thought he was fine. Johnny had left instructions in his will asking his children to allow Raine 6 months at Althorp to settle her affairs and gather her things. That is the wish his heirs chose to ignore. Within 2 days, on March 31st, Charles and Diana had her out of the house, and the eviction was carried out with a thoroughness that even sympathetic writers have struggled to soften. This is the scene the cold open described, and it deserves to be told once in full. Raine was not permitted to remove a single object unless she could prove she personally owned it, and her staff were dismissed without notice. Diana stood guard in the bedroom while the maid packed the Countess's wardrobe into Louis Vuitton suitcases, then, spotting the monogrammed S on the cases, decided the luggage belonged to the Spencers and had the clothes repacked into black bin liners. Charles kicked the sacks down the same saloon staircase where Diana had pushed Raine 3 years before. Diana's own verdict on her stepmother in that moment, recorded in a later biography, was flat and final. That woman, she said, was X, no longer her stepmother. The furs and the couture went out the back in plastic, and the marriage of 16 years ended in refuse sacks bouncing down the stairs. There is a case to be made, and the family made it loudly, that Raine had it coming, that the years of pink sofas and vanished Van Dykes had earned her that exit. But hold the ledger up honestly, and the arithmetic does not balance. She had nursed the man who left her that will back from a coma. She had run the estate that his heir was now inheriting intact enough to fight over. She had done, for 16 years, the unglamorous work of keeping a great house solvent, and her reward, 48 hours after the death of the husband she had saved, was to be treated as a thief in her own home, and dressed out of it in garbage bags. Johnny's own will had asked for 6 months and a measure of dignity for his widow, and his children overrode him within 2 days of his last breath, which tells you that the war had never really been about paintings or sofas at all. It had been about who owned the memory of the house, and the children meant to own it completely, and the fastest way to do that was to make the outsider vanish before the funeral flowers had wilted. Raine, Countess Spencer, paid for competence with love over and over until the bill came due on a staircase in Northamptonshire. What makes the ending of this story so strange is that the hatred did not hold. Raine remarried within a year, taking Count Jean-François de Chambrun in a 1993 wedding that lasted until a 1995 divorce, after which she went on styling herself Raine, Countess Spencer, whether convention allowed it or not. But the reversal that matters happened not with a count, but with the stepdaughter who had shoved her down the stairs. Around 1993, as Diana's own marriage collapsed into public ruin, she made the first move and invited Raine to a tearful reconciliation, telling her she knew Raine had loved her father deeply and was grateful for the years of happiness she had given him. The two women who had fought over Johnny's house wept and embraced, and from then on they met regularly for lunch at the Connaught Grill and spoke on the telephone almost daily. Diana's butler, Paul Burrell, put the logic of it best, saying that in the end Diana was an outcast, and Raine was an outcast too, and so they became great friends, and that the woman very much hated at the beginning was very much loved at the end. Diana had learned through her own divorce and her estrangement from her birth mother exactly what it felt like to be cast out of a family that had once been hers. Her relationship with Francis had curdled by then, not speaking in the months before the crash after Francis gave a paid magazine interview criticising her daughter's choices, and into that vacancy stepped the very woman Diana had once tried to throttle. Ingrid Seward recorded the sentence that finished the arc, Diana's own words, that she would rather speak to Raine than to her own mother, that Raine was the mother she never had. It was the most complete reversal imaginable, spoken by the child who had coined the name Acid Rain. Then the losses came in a row. On August 31st, 1997, Diana was killed in the Paris crash, and Raine, close by then to the Al-Fayed family, was among the first people in the world told that the stepdaughter who had finally loved her was dead. 3 years later, on May 21st, 2000, Barbara Cartland died in her sleep at 98. And the mother who had built Raine from the outside in was gone too. What remained was work. Raine had joined the board of Harrods after Mohammed Al-Fayed made good on a lunchtime joke of Diana's by appointing her a director of Harrods International, and she took it as seriously as she took everything, working the shop floor, travelling to 16 countries for the business, and putting in night shifts at the distribution centre in a packer's apron into her 80s. She testified at the 2007 inquest into Diana's death, telling the coroner that Diana had always said she had no hidden agenda, that so many people wanted something out of a woman that famous, and that it had been a very draining life. Charles Spencer never apologised. In a 2010 Vanity Fair essay he softened intellectually, granting that his stepmother had been formidable and even, in her way, effective, but he stopped short of contrition for the bin bags and the years of war. Raine, Countess Spencer, died on October 21st, 2016, aged 87, in her Belgravia flat, of a cancer she kept private to the end, having hosted a farewell dinner for 30 friends weeks before and let none of them know it was goodbye. She left an estate of around £5.8 million, the quiet rebuttal to a family myth that had cast her as a woman who bled the Spencers and squandered the proceeds. She was no ruined adventuress, but a wealthy woman in her own right, and she left nothing at all to any Spencer. No member of the family came to her funeral. The child who had learned to call her mother was already gone, and the ones who remained had never learned it at all, which is the last and truest measure of a woman who won every battle in that house and lost forever, the only war that counts. And now we'd like to see you in the comments. Was Raine Spencer the villain of the House of Spencer, or the one person who did the thankless work and was hated for it anyway? We look forward to hearing your personal thoughts below. And thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Allure.